Hello and welcome to Noble Mind.
Noble Mind is a podcast exploring mindfulness, meditation, and psychology.
Hello, I'm Kate King.
And I'm Alex Gökçe. In this episode, we talk to Nadia Colburn about the power of mindful storytelling and creativity to shape our inner and outer worlds for more peace and justice.
Nadia Colburn is the founder of Align Your Story Writing School. Her poetry and prose have been published in more than 80 publications, including The New Yorker, Kenyon Review, Harvard Review, Spirituality and Health, and Lion's Roar. She's also the author of the poetry book The High Shelf. Nadia holds a PhD in English from Columbia University and a bachelor's degree from Harvard. She is a certified yoga teacher, a serious student of Thich Nhat Hanh, and an activist for social and environmental justice. You can learn more about Nadia and join our email list at noblemindpodcast.com. We hope you find our conversation engaging and inspiring.
Thank you so much for joining us, Nadia. We're really glad to have you. Would you start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. So I am a writer and a teacher and a coach, and my background is my professional background is I have a PhD in English. I grew up in a house full of books. My parents both worked in New York City publishing, and I grew up loving to read. So I was really, in this kind of literary landscape, and I went to college actually thinking, I'm going to do something other than become a literature professor, but that's kind of what I went off to do. This is a long answer to your simple question. But when I was kind of in the middle of my PhD program, I felt that much as I loved studying literature, I wanted something that felt a little bit bigger and more expansive. And I was a new mother, and I wanted to listen more deeply to the stories that my body had to tell me and other ways of interacting with the world, not only from my head, but also from my heart. And I would say that that really is what has been motivating me ever since then. My first child's 20 now, so it's been a long time, really to bring together the head and the heart, the mind and the body, the personal and the social, and to come to a more integrative experience and to share that with people through my writing and through my teaching.
You've put storytelling, writing, and healing at the center of your life. What do you see as most important or transformative about creative writing or the power of storytelling more broadly?
Sure. Well, as I said, I grew up really loving to read. And part of my own personal transformation was when I became a mother, it became really important to me not only to love and support other people's writing, but also to claim my own story as a woman, as a mother, and to then kind of model that for my children. How will they have their own story? And we really, as humans, as conscious human beings, we live in a physical world, but also a storied world. And the stories we tell are so important pretty much on every level. And we see now the danger of telling fake stories. What happens if we don't tell the right stories? Who has control over the stories that are told? And, every dictator, the first thing that he wants to control is the media, the stories. Because if you can control those stories, you get inside someone's being, really, and control them from the inside out. So when we come to tell our own stories about ourselves, tell more integrated stories, tell more whole stories, tell more unique stories, because each of us has a different story, then we are healthier. And by story, I don't just mean a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, but really something that's more complex and nuanced. We have multiple stories on multiple dimensions, and to be able to tap into that kind of multiplicity, but that truth for each of us is deeply, deeply healing on so many levels. And I can talk more about that, but that's, what I'm really interested in making happen. And of course, that's also, what therapists do to some extent, to a large extent, is to tap into those personal stories and take out the knots so that they are more clear and we can live more fully.
So being able to author our own stories is essential to having agency and shaping our world and ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, it's all so complex. That's absolutely true. And as a woman, something that is so important is to tell stories, to tell women's stories, because we've lived in a society that's been mostly telling the male-dominated story for a long time. And everything is multiple because at the same time, the very language that we use is not unique to any of us. We're using a tradition. And my Buddhist background kind of helps me with that, or what I've learned from Buddhism, I would say, just because, we can hold multiple experiences at once. There's both self and non-self. And so we carry an individual story, and yet that individual story is composed of all the non-self parts. The self is made up of the non-self. So our story is both unique to us and part of a larger story, the story of our culture, the story of our family, the story of our species. And so I think sometimes when people talk about you need to author your own story as if we're unique, we are unique individuals, but as if we live in a vacuum, whereas I think it's so much more exciting really to think about the ways in which we are dual, we're multidimensional, and we're both self and non-self. It's our unique story, but it also taps into all these other larger stories.
I'm glad you're saying that, because I think sometimes when people talk about maybe claiming their story or telling their life story or something, it does have this very singular, unitary, solid kind of quality, which I don't think really maps onto a lot of people's actual reality when you sit down and try to do it and try to write about your experiences. And suddenly you realize you're of two minds about the same thing, or that you could look at your life experiences and sort of spin them this way or spin them that way. Or, even depending on the state of mind you're in, you can tell yourself that, your parents were wonderful parents and they did the best they could and everything was great and whatever. Or you could just be selectively remembering all the terrible experiences and saying oh man, they really messed things up or whatever,
Yeah.
and the stories are really framed by kind of the mindset we're in when we're telling them. And yeah, they're not so solid, I guess, is what I'm getting to.
Right.
Yeah.
And to think of our storytelling then as creative acts where we can be creative, experimental, write and rewrite and read and reread. And I know I have this experience all the time where I can read a text and think, oh, I understand that perfectly. That's about X, Y, or Z. And then I read it again and I say, oh, wow, look, there are all these other things there in the text that I didn't notice the first time. And the same thing can happen with our own writing, our own story, that there isn't the one final version. And I've been talking a lot to my students recently about jazz, about how we don't need to think that there's this one final version. We're always improvising. It's always changing. And here, Buddhist teachings are helpful again. It's all impermanent. It's always changing. This is one version at one moment of time. But there's some versions that are more true than others. So to find the version that feels right and alive and playful and exciting at this moment and have it evolve into whatever the next moment is. But it's not static and it's not singular.
But then imposing by even suggesting or by the culture's understanding a unitary story shapes and perhaps distorts one's understanding. So for instance, about the self, to what extent am I my ideas, which I've gotten from other people?
Right. That's why I always think, we have to be playful and experimental, but there isn't a final answer to that question. And that one of the things that is so wonderful about writing is that the very questions that we're talking about here, we can put into our text. We can interrogate our own story in our own text. We can say something and then question it and say it again. We can say, some days I feel this and some days I feel that. And in this moment, I feel both of these things at once. So I think that's just becoming if I'm answering your question, that becomes a more skillful writer to show the way that we come out of the unified story into more complexity and greater dimensionality and greater truth ultimately. Maxine Hong Kingston's Woman Warrior, which is just such a great memoir, has this great chapter where she tells a whole story, and then she says, well, actually, that's my brother's version of it. And actually, my brother got this version from my sister, but I'm not sure that anyone really knows what happened. And she does that again and again, kind of playing with the storytelling. And I think that that's how we live, right? I mean, for most of us, especially, we've been through therapy, we think, oh, I had this one version of my life, and then I had another version, then I had another version. I don't think that I was, I know I was born and raised, well, I was born in Paris actually, but I was raised in New York City, but, there's certain parameters to it, but I can tell lots of different stories about my family. My family is very complicated.
As are most.
and everyone who has siblings will say, well, there's my story and there's my sibling's story. Again, to go back to the Maxine Hong Kingston. And there's a famous movie, Rashomon, which shows the same scene again and again through different observers. So what really happened. But I think that helps us to see what is true and what isn't true. That there is complexity, but there's also a basic level of fact. And I think that we're so really inundated by the dangers of fake news now. And so we don't want to say, no, there's one absolute fact and everyone has to agree with that. We have to be supple enough to be able to say, well, there is space for some level of uncertainty, but there are also parameters. There are also places in which, no, I was born in Paris, but I did not grow up in Paris. That's just not true, And I think that it's really important, like that we get comfortable with some shades of gray. It's not all good and bad, right? It's not just black and white, but there also are parameters for what's acceptable, what's not, and what's true and what's not.
Well, and when you're working with or reading things written by or engaging in the world, with people who sort of who share that view, that they want to both respect different points of view but also find some common ground, then I think that's not a problem. But as you said previously, there are other people who will want to step in and manipulate the story, change the facts. And I can also see that in families too, that there's sometimes a person in the family who wants to control the family story, like this is the kind of childhood you had. We were great to you or whatever. And it's very intimidating. And when you're interacting with someone like that, it becomes very difficult to hold on to your own story.
Yeah, well, that's actually a large part of my story. And it's become actually more clear to me that, oh, that's why I do this work. That it was very hard for me to integrate because my own family growing up had so many wonderful qualities and so many things that were just really challenging. Mm-hmm. But the story was, it's all great. And so it was so hard to figure out how the different aspects of my childhood experience could fit together. And so I think that that's really what I'm tuning into, to being in the world and in my work, to help people integrate the multiplicity, the different parts of themselves, whether it's, the different parts of childhood or the different ways in which we walk through the world as a public person and a private person, or, with a mind and a body or whatever it is, but just to do that work of integrating. And it gets so complicated for writers because in claiming our own story and being public about our story, then it's our story, but it's also the story, it touches the story of other people in our life. And I have so many students who, struggle with this, and I do too, right? Like, how do we tell our truth and not hurt someone else? And how do my truth isn't necessarily the same as your truth, and to kind of make peace with that and to say, okay, well, this is my version. I can stand by it, and to do it with good intentions. But it's a real issue for a lot of writers. And I think for a lot of writers, the men were usually the writers, and there was this kind of machismo, not that men are like this, most men are like this now at all, but I think there was a tradition that, yeah, we're just truth tellers and it doesn't matter if we hurt people because we're just showing up as great artists and that's the highest form. And I think there are so many women that I work with who are so concerned about not hurting people that they almost go in the other direction of, I'm not going to say anything because it might hurt someone. And I think that it's finding that middle ground of having good intentions, being mindful, not wanting to hurt people, but also coming forward. This is my truth. This is what's happened. This is what's happened to me. And I think that we see, the Me Too movement is an example of so many women and also men coming forward and saying, this is what happened to me. I'm going to break those taboos and just tell the truth.
When we don't share our story because we're afraid of hurting other people, I think we end up sometimes hurting ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. And, again, as people who are therapists know that if people live without coming to their truth, without expressing their truth, their experiences, it causes all kinds of problems. And there are emotional problems, but also physical problems. It can really, on a physical level, kind of block one's immune system and create a lot of problems.
Could you share more about your personal experience of how writing has been a healing practice for you?
I think it's always healing on a number of different levels. I think that even independent of, kind of going in and, I have in my own past childhood trauma, and I had health problems that were kind of undiagnosed. And it's a long, complicated story, as most stories actually, in fact, are. I had a parasite, and then it interacted with this and that. But I think the combination of the physical and the psychological was really hard to kind of uncrack. And it was only really when I was able to go back in and really look more accurately at my childhood experiences that I was able to finally really heal from that parasite, and my body, my immune system really kicked in and could do the work and really get healthy. Because I was always, I think, a little bit fighting against myself, and my body was carrying the story. So when I could put the story outside of myself, and I did a lot of different forms of therapy, and they're all great, but including just sitting down and finally writing out my story. And at the time I was like, am I going to publish this? Am I not going to publish this? And I just said, okay, I'm going to put that out of my mind, and I'm just going to write it. And I have published parts of it, but the whole kind of narrative that I wrote, once I was done writing it, it was like very clear that it had served the purpose at that particular time, and I didn't need to publish the whole thing. But it gave me a lot more energy for other projects. It was like what had been carried in my body, I was able to put on the page and then move on and help other people really go through the process. And some people are publishing a lot, some people aren't. That's a personal decision, but I think putting it on the page is really, really helpful. And with that kind of narrative clarity of putting the different pieces together through narrative. And through also imaginative. It doesn't only need to be narrative, but through the creative, imaginative mind.
So maybe thinking about different types of writing, is that sort of like free association or fiction or nonfiction or poetry? Do you see any of these as having more impact as we're talking about as a healing process, or is it more kind of individual, what works for the person?
I think that really different forms are healing in different ways. For me, at least, writing poetry is incredibly fulfilling and satisfying, and I feel like healing, but not only healing, but it's like it must boost my immune system because it brings me joy, right? And we know that dancing and laughing and being with friends and hugging people, like that's as important for our immune system as, sometimes taking more toxic medicine. So we need to do all kinds of different things.
And it must also be healing that other people's stories parallel ours. They help us uncover our truth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one reason also that we read, right? That we recognize ourselves often in, a book written 200 years ago, or a book written 3,000 miles away or 5,000 miles away, more than we recognize ourselves in, daily conversations we might be having with people around us, as important as those are. But sometimes in reading, there's like that deep connection that comes through the written word.
Also thinking about what you were saying about the importance of hearing other people's stories that mirror yours in some way, or I was thinking about that, Alex, as you were talking too. If women's voices haven't been heard, and then we start to hear women's stories, you suddenly realize, like, oh, I'm not alone. I think blanking on her name, last name is Haidt. She wrote this Haidt report in the 70s about women's sexuality and difficulties having orgasm during intercourse and things like that. And before that was sort of publicly spoken about in this big report she wrote. She recently passed away and there was an obituary. So it's like on my mind right now. I don't just think about this all day long. But people didn't have any shared experience. They weren't maybe talking about it, so women thought there was something wrong with me, but then when other women's stories came out through all these interviews she did, then they realized, oh, this is just a human experience. This is something that's so true for so many women, and so suddenly the whole landscape changes, just by hearing those voices.
Yeah, that's such a good example.
What do you see as the most healing aspects of writing?
Oh gosh, there's so many things, but
Yeah.
I'll go back to a question that you asked earlier also about different genres, because I do think that writing in different genres can access different parts of ourselves. So, for example, poetry, which is much less linear, can, I think, access a deeper level of unconsciousness, a deeper level of intuition, get outside of the kind of rational brain into deeper other ways of knowing. And so I'm very interested in story not only being in language, even though I'm a writer working with language, but that's why I talk a lot about using meditation, using embodied practices to tap into the stories that our bodies hold. And poetry can be a really great way to go to that nonverbal part of ourselves and translate it into language. And, for anyone who has experience with trauma is often nonverbal. It's caught in a kind of nonverbal space, but it's carried in the body. And poetry is often a great way to access that, to put into language the unspeakable. But the same thing, I mean, you brought it up, but orgasm, right, Kate? It's not only the negative that is caught in the non-language. Also, great joy, great wonder is often kind of outside of language, that kind of epiphanic moment. And poetry can help us use language to get to other ways of being. And so that's, one of the things I love about writing poetry. I feel like I can tap into my poetry often has a wisdom that I don't access in other ways, whether it's, my traumatic story or my joyful story or anything in between. It's often there before I am. I'm not a fiction writer, but friends who are fiction writers tell me that imaginative ability to take a story and reshape it is just so powerful and wonderful. And I work with some fiction writers, so I see how other people do that. That's not something that I myself really do. And then writing essays and memoir is such a great way to, I find, go into the complexities, the nuances, the multiplicity, and put together a narrative, but also allow it to create new forms and new shapes. So I really think that working in different genres, I don't know if there's one that I would say is most healing, but I do think that the method of writing that's most healing is a method that is consciously connected to the body. And that most of us are taught to write in ways that are very disconnected from the body. We go to school and we write with our rational brain and we sit in desks. And that when we can tap into learning how to listen to the body and connect that with our writing, bring the verbal and the nonverbal together, then that is the most healing.
Can you share an example of what that might look like or feel like a little mini practice or something? Because I imagine that sounds sort of confusing to some people.
I think, it's kind of where, this is also work that we do in therapy, right? Where are we experiencing our experiences? often we think, oh, I'm feeling sad. But, then we like, well, where are you feeling that? Oh, it's actually, I'm feeling this kind of like in the pit of my stomach. It's feeling like a little heavy and like a rock's down there in my stomach. And then we're used to translating that into sad. But is it really coming from our brain, or is it coming from a physical experience? And I think therapy helps us with that. I think meditation helps us with that. We're sitting with an experience. And so I think people who don't have experience meditating think, oh, it's all about the brain, the mind, right? But I practice Vipassana meditation, and I practice in the tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh, and both of them, and also I've done some Buddhist, Tibetan meditation, but it's really like paying attention to what you are experiencing in your body. Notice, I'm always feeling things in my body, and then my mind is reacting to those things that are happening in my body. So this disconnect between the mind and the body that we're so used to in our Western culture, you start to rethink, well, what's the mind? What's the body? Those are just language, words too. So to get to your question, a very simple way to connect mind and body when we're writing is by meditating before we write, which is I often have like a practice where I have these little 15-minute meditations and then writing sessions. And it's just so transformative to, before you sit down to write, just take a few minutes to meditate and connect with your breath. That's connecting with your body. To feel, do a body scan, to feel what you're feeling, and to come out of that rational brain and just come into more awareness. And when we have more awareness, we open our senses. We're, oh, I'm here in my body. And then to stay connected to that as we're writing, to stay connected to where are these images coming from. And then we also clear away all the static that we come to our writing session with, so that we're no longer just sitting down with our laundry list in our brains, but we're sitting down with something that's deeper, at a deeper level, where we're connected to our body and feeling what we're feeling. And so, I've had people who, in a 10 minutes of writing after a 5-minute meditation, are able to write these incredible long pieces that they just felt blocked and they couldn't write in like 2-hour-long writing sessions, because it just goes so much more deeply and more authentically into one's experiences.
I'm reminded of Eugene Gendlin, who coined the term felt sense, who came up with experiential focusing. He had a study and he discovered that when you listen to clients who stay in their heads versus clients who sort of pause and say, how do I feel about that? When they use metaphors, then they were healing because they were processing and moving forward.
That sounds wonderful. I'll have to look for his work. But definitely, I think that all of these different fields, writing, meditation, therapy, and they're all kinds of forms of therapy, right? Somatic therapy, talk therapy, et cetera, but, it's like we find that pause. So often it would always kind of bother me where yoga teachers are like, just drop the story. You don't need a story. It's like, drop the old story, but we are story creating animals. We can't really live without some story, but we're often trapped in an old story. So where can we find that moment where the story changes? And this is something like that the Dalai Lama talks about a lot, right? Because each moment with real awareness, there's possibility for radical change, because we are stopping that habit energy. And, so much of our story is habit energy. It's what we've inherited. So we get aware, what's the story I'm telling here? What are some tools to pause, to stop, to notice something different, and then to tell a slightly different story, and not to only tell it in the brain, but to tell it through the body. So a metaphor helps us activate the body by feeling something different, so that we can think something different, so that we can live something different.
Well, I think about my own experience trying, when I sit down and do creative writing myself, that that experience you're describing, for me, I think of it as it's almost like I'm making a clearing, that there's this like settling, this sort of centering and this creating some space. And it's like a meditative moment. It's not necessarily a formal practice, but there's this kind of opening and then letting whatever sort of arises arise, but there is this sort of like, if you were to track by the minute, the practice that I'm doing, there are these little moments of like, pause, space, make space, open, clear the ground, something grows, something comes up. So I can see how maybe a more formal meditation practice before a writing session would do something very similar or even allow to go deeper.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also encourage students to do some embodied movement, and I often will lead them in a little bit of yoga. And, in my own experience, sometimes back when we could actually do things in person, I would teach yoga and writing classes in yoga studios. But I also have an online class that is yoga, meditation, and writing. And so it has yoga videos, and then you can practice with just the audio and then write. And I've been able to, in my own experience, tap into really deep stories through doing different yoga poses. I mean, I know, for example, my hips, like they carry a lot of challenge in my hips. So when I can go into something like pigeon pose, where you're really working on those deep hip movements and letting go the tension in your hips, then sometimes I can ease into a deeper level of my own story. So doing that movement can help us both tap into old stories and also get stuck. It's like we're energetic beings. So that energy is flowing through us, and there's room for something new to come.
So moving in certain new ways sort of unlocks access to some information or some part of ourselves. Or
Yeah. And I have students who do all kinds of cool things. Like now, sometimes they'll dictate their writing into their phone. So one of my students lives near the beach, and she has a series of poems she's written where she's gone out and walked on the beach every morning and dictates a poem into her phone. And I can always tell the poems that she's written when she was walking, because they really have a different kind of level of energy, attention. We don't need to write from a static position. And actually, it's not just phones. The technology of phones is something cool that we can use now, but writers in the past would often dictate their work. Someone then would be sitting there writing it. So the novelist Henry James, for example, who, if anyone knows his work, is one of the most highly written kind of sounding authors. But in fact, he dictated most of his novels. But it's just fun to try different processes as we're writing.
Yeah, I have done a little dictation and found that helpful. Not for poetry for me necessarily. I haven't figured that one out yet, but for more nonfiction essay kind of stuff, sometimes it just flows a little faster. I've also noticed differences between typing and handwriting, writing longhand. And for me right now, typing seems to be able to keep up faster, actually. I don't know. That's just because I haven't been writing longhand as much as I used to. So I'm slower now, but it's not because there's anything inherently better, I think, about typing, but for whatever reason, the speed of it allows me to sort of stay with my thoughts more, sort of right in the moment with the thought.
Yeah, I think that's such a great example. People often ask me, which is better, to write on the computer, type it, or to write by hand? And what does the scientific research show? And I just really think, like, do what works for you. And, it might be different at different times. My kind of poetry mentor is Jory Graham, and she always said, oh, you have to write on a typewriter. And I just think this is so classic because, that's just like this one little moment in our history where the typewriter was, when she was writing on a typewriter, and she's probably still writing on a typewriter, it was like an old technology, but, it had been invented, but it wasn't the newest thing. But anyway, there isn't one right way to write, but I think that's the same for everyone. But for her, a typewriter was great, And for someone else, it could be something else, but try different things and see what works for you and be open to being flexible, I think.
Yeah. There's something about longhand. You can scribble around and be nonlinear.
Mm-hmm.
One thing we haven't really gotten into yet is being sort of on the other side of the writing, being on the reading side or on the listening side, and sort of bearing witness to each other's stories. And, so you talked about deep listening. I wonder if it would be nice to hear a little bit about that as well.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And we all need to express ourselves, and we all need to be heard, and we all need to listen to others. And those are all really basic human needs. And the writing process helps us with that as well. And so, it's not just writing, but also sharing our work with others that's so powerful. And the deep listening happens on kind of so many levels. We listen deeply to ourselves in that first draft of the writing. Then we listen deeply to ourselves again in the revision process. A lot of times when people talk about writing and healing, they're talking only about that first draft. But there's so much that happens in the revision process where we listen deeply to ourselves. We revise, we make the story more coherent, we give it shape, we make it beautiful, and we become our own witness in a different way. So that's so beautiful. And then sharing it with someone else is so beautiful. That sharing is such a deep human connection, and then listening to someone else's story. So there's so many levels of deep listening and of really gift giving on all of these different levels that writing helps facilitate. And we already talked about, how amazing it is that we can have these deep connections and moments of insight and understanding from works written halfway around the world or works written, hundreds of years ago, works where someone is so different from us, but we also feel such a connection.
The way that you just said that, I don't think I've quite heard anyone say before, although it connects to things I've heard before, but I think it emphasizes something really different, which is that there's a need, that we have a human need to listen.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard people say, which I agree with, that we are social animals and we have a need for social connection and relationship and relatedness and that kind of stuff. But I haven't quite heard it underlined in that way, that actually what that means to connect is to listen, because I would say, maybe I'll just speak for myself and say that can be hard, when life is busy and there's a lot of stress and everyone's got their own agenda, it can be hard to slow down and really hear each other. But that's how you connect.
Yeah. And Thich Nhat Hanh talks so much about the gift of deep listening and how, if you really want to give someone a gift, listen deeply to them. But I really think that every gift is reciprocal. A real gift goes both ways, because if it only is going one way, that it doesn't really feel right. It's when we're connected. I'm sure scientists can talk about it, but there's like some, in that moment of connection, of reciprocity, there's some like deep dopamine release, right? I mean, whether it's like the mirror neurons where you're kind of firing up and it's like, oh, this is good. This is what we do as humans. We connect, right? And it really, like, the sacred is a sense of connection. So listening is not just giving to someone else, but receiving from someone else. It's that connection.
So writing and sharing can be a part of the Me Too or Black Lives Matter healing process as well. And it can move these processes forward, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think really every human on our globe, black, white, female, male, transgender, whatever it is, we all come from a history of complexity and trauma, and also joy and love and companionship and cooperation. But there's trauma in all of our stories. And when we can acknowledge that and acknowledge, it's not just all black or like all hard, but the complexity and the multiplicity, then I think we can come to that place of healing ourselves and healing as a society.
Right, and really starting to see the common threads there, as you're saying, that we all have these complex histories and come from these complex family lineages and cultural and, national generations of real hardship and survivorship, but also real struggle and challenge too. I do feel like, even though it wasn't on my list of questions, as we've been talking a lot about writing, I've also been thinking that probably many of our listeners might have the experience of sort of wanting to write or aspiring to write, but feeling stuck or blocked in some way, or feeling like I can't write, or I judge myself when I write. That seems like a very, there's so many people, so many would-be writers in the world, but there's such a barrier of self-criticism and self-judgment that keeps people away from even starting. So I'm wondering, as a writing coach and a person who I'm sure has encountered some of this, at least with the people you work with, how to help people through that obstacle.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, the level of judgment and self-criticism and block that comes up. And I mean, I have a lot of thoughts about that because I've been doing this for a long time. And I think that the concern that people have about writing and the judgment that comes up is really an internalization of a hierarchical culture that values some voices over others, and that we, from a very early age, internalize. So this is something I write about and talk about, but I also have just on my website a little free, it's a 33-page ebook that's called Embrace Your Story, the 7 Steps to Writing with More Power and Ease. And that's really about looking at what happens with authorship and how authorship and authority get conflated, and the misuse of authority gets internalized when we sit down to write often. So to come out of that into a more authentic authority when we write, and the steps to do that, including connecting with the body and the breath and meditation. And I have a lot of writing exercises and prompts and even recordings for people. So if anyone wants to get started, that is a free book that I offer just on my website. But it's something that I put together because exactly the question that you asked, what do people do, I've seen in so many people. So I wanted just to have this as a way to address those concerns right off the bat with people. Okay, here are the common mistakes, or not mistakes even, but the common kind of history that I see people coming to the page with. And here are some tools to get past them so that you can really feel aligned and in sync with your writing and come out of blocks and just have a better time as a writer, because so many people do want to be writing but feel like they can't quite access that, and that's a shame.
Yeah, sounds like a great resource and much needed. I feel like I could, one of my soapboxes, has something to do with the way that somehow so many of us have learned early on that we're not, quote, creative, or not, quote, talented, or not, quote, whatever, enough to share our voice with the world, whether it's through writing or any other kind of creative expression, that we've sort of internalized that. I don't know when it starts. There is this point where people just decide, like, I can't write, I'm not talented, I don't have that skill, or like, I'm not that kind of person. And it sort of puts creativity over there or writing over there. And it's so sad. It's to me like it's a great tragedy.
Yeah, creativity is dangerous. If you unleash people's creativity, oh man, they're not going to be just following you thoughtlessly anymore. So, but it is really interesting to see it just perpetuated from generation to generation.
This has been a great conversation, Nadia. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if people are stimulated and engaged by this conversation, how can they reach you and find you and out there in the world?
Well, thank you again very much for having me. It's been a pleasure talking with you, Kate and Alex. And I'm pretty easy to find. You can just go to nadiacolburn.com. You can just Google Nadia Colburn, Colburn, and my website comes up. And I have a lot of free resources for writers, including that ebook and including some videos and just a lot of free resources for writers, recordings with meditations. And I'm also very easy to reach. So you can send me an email or just contact me through my contact form on my website. And I always love to hear from people. And I offer lots of classes online and one-on-one coaching, and really just am passionate about helping support people's voices, people's stories, people's creativity. So reach out to me, and I'd love to hear from you.
Great. Thanks so much, Nadia.
Thank you, Kate.
Wonderful to meet you.
Thank you, Alex.
Thanks for listening today.
If you enjoyed this episode, we hope you'll hit subscribe, leave us a great rating or review, and spread the word. You can also go to noblemindpodcast.com to join our email list. You'll get a weekly behind-the-scenes message, news, announcements, and other special goodies we come up with just for you. Thanks for listening, and bye for now.